Welcome to the Catapult Effect, a podcast where professionals like you turn challenges into opportunities for extraordinary growth. If you're tired of struggling, feeling lost, and ready to catapult yourself into the best version of you, then you're in the right place. Here's your host, Katie Wrigley.
Welcome back to the Catapult Effect podcast. Today I have with me another fellow, part of the Future Policing Institute. I haven't talked about it too much on the show yet, but I'm definitely going to drop a link in there. It is an amazing organization focused on future policing, named aptly, right? So I have with me Ben Haiman today. Am I saying that right, Ben?
You are.
Okay, great. I should have checked with you before I dove in. Ben serves as the Executive Director for Public Safety and Justice with the University of Virginia and most recently served as Chief of Staff for the Washington, D.C. Metropolitan Police Department. That is no joke policing. Wow. His background has focused on policing operations, recruitment, education, and technology. Welcome to the Catapult Effect podcast, Ben. I'm so excited to have this opportunity to talk with you like this.
Katie, likewise. Thank you so much for having me here today. Look forward to the conversation.
Me too. So Ben and I were talking ahead of time as far as what we wanted to focus on, and we want to really bring to light the issues with police recruitment. So you may or may not have read a headline that I am going to say I'm not qualified to speak to what happened on a professional level there. But there was a woman in Illinois that was killed in July, and it was a police-involved shooting. And there was a lot that went down there. Again, I'm not qualified to speak to it, but there are a lot of cops that are cringing over that because it was not handled the way that police officers should handle it. And this really led me to the two places we want to talk about today is police recruitment and how this is playing into offer resiliency. And so Ben is perfectly positioned to be an expert on this subject and be able to help with those. So if you want to speak directly to what you saw within the Sonia Massey shooting, Ben, you're welcome to, but I just want to kind of open it up and say, like, what are some of the problems we're seeing in recruitment these days with police officers?
Absolutely, Katie. And without being an actual investigating authority on that, I'm only able to really speak to what I observe, which is what I think a lot of the public observed as well. And the expectation from the public for law enforcement is very high, and rightfully so. Police officers in our country have a tremendous amount of autonomy, authority, and ability to perform their duties, which can have pretty dire consequences depending what outcomes are kind of achieved. Obviously, I think that there's a lot of challenging circumstances that police officers face every single day. The unpredictable nature of policing, today, in today's era, a lot of police officers, their news cycle that they get is informed by their peer networks. In the era of social media, they're seeing over and over again instances of police officers being the victims of assaults, various ambushes and so forth. And so that's part of the mindset that officers encounter in every situation that they go into. Looking at that particular, video, at least from, my vantage, there were a lot of missed opportunities, to, change the environmental context, opportunities for intervention and de-escalation, opportunities to really kind of change the dynamic of how law enforcement showed up in that particular scene. I think it's yet again a tragic, kind of outcome, not only for the family, the community, but the law enforcement profession overall. And I am interested in the lessons that we learn from it and ways that we can again not repeat again and again, kind of encounters that law enforcement has with the public.
Thank you. And thank you for being so gracious with your position on there and what you're able to deduce from that situation. And like I said, I'm not qualified to speak to it at all. So what would you say some of the underlying factors are around recruitment that are playing into creating these tragic situations? Because these are the ones that we want to reduce. Obviously, these are the situations that lead to mistrust with police, that lead to this anti-police sentiment that ultimately led to all the defunding of police that's really hurting all of us across the country now?
Police recruitment has always been a challenge. And in the last 4 or 5 years nationally, we've seen a huge increase in that challenge, in particular within major city environments. Small sheriff departments, in particular sheriff offices that are run by elected leaders, are not experiencing the same challenges as major cities are today. But what I'm seeing and hearing as I work with departments all across the country is real challenges around finding sufficient qualified candidates. And let me break that down a little bit further. 10 years ago, where you'd have, 10, 15 applicants putting in for a few positions, now you're having a few positions and a few candidates putting in for those same roles. Mm-hmm. That's not true everywhere. As I talk to police chiefs and executives around the country, there are still agencies that have a competitive hiring environment. But more often than not, what I'm hearing right now is that there's frankly more positions than interest, and that's in big cities and small alike, where simply the money, while they're offering hiring bonuses, they're offering additional compensation and take-home vehicles and all these incentives they're layering on. They're really trying to recruit from a very limited pool. Now that comes from a few different aspects. One, the national labor pool is smaller than it has been. With that, the economy has rebounded in many ways, so people have options. While departments across the country have reduced educational standards, that necessarily hasn't achieved the outcome that a lot of places were hoping that it would have, and so you're still finding shortages of qualified folks. And police hiring, it's interesting. You'd think in most hiring environments and in the corporate world, you try to identify the skill sets you need, you reach out to that kind of talent, and you try to recruit them into those positions. Police hiring is very different. Police hiring, and this is pretty consistent across the country, is done through a series of cuts. You start with people that express interest, and then you administer, let's say, a written examination. You cut a certain number of candidates. Then you administer a physical ability test, and you cut a certain number of candidates, a background, a polygraph, a medical, a psychological. And let's say you started with 1,000 candidates, and at the end you're left with 10 people that have not been cut through any other part of the process. There's a false pretense there that those candidates that are left are the most qualified people. They're not. They're just the ones that didn't get eliminated. And hopefully they're the best qualified candidates, but they also might be the candidates that just simply haven't had theft issues, never used drugs, it didn't have any medical issues and so forth, but might be totally an uninspiring candidate for the policing profession. And so I think as police leaders, we also have to rethink the paradigm. And I'm not saying we should start hiring, individuals with less than stellar backgrounds or who have been on the wrong side of the law. But what I'm saying is we have to think about how we intentionally recruit police officers into the profession, and people that have a service mindset, who understand that moment between guardian and warrior policing, it's a split-second decision, right? If the situation calls for a warrior, and you're coming in with the mindset of a guardian, that time to get yourself escalated to the appropriate level is just as much of a failure as the reverse of that, right? You come in at a point expecting a tumultuous situation, but it's really a false call, and the situation's down here. That time for a police officer to go up or down is really their success or failure. We need in the policing profession critical thinkers that have a service mindset that really not only care about the community, but care about, the upholding, our constitutional protections. And this is a lot to ask someone for $50,000 a year, $55,000 a year, or some West Coast departments closer to, $80,000 or $90,000 a year. But this is a lot of different expectations to put on someone, and so just to pivot the conversation a little bit in this, but I've been studying through my doctoral work different models of police education and looking at different mindsets that other countries apply to the policing profession. And U.S. I think is an outlier with some in terms of the path into the policing profession. You can take someone who's really not worked or worked very, kind of basic entry level jobs. And in some places, as few as 9 weeks, now has a badge and a gun and the authority to, to enforce, the laws in that jurisdiction. Policing is a profession that's gained through years and years and years of experience. And while there's a lot of ways that I think you can kind of shorten that experience, we're putting a tremendous amount of responsibility on individuals with very little kind of background, education, and training to do that work. So we keep seeing these tragedies occur nationally, and we keep commissioning, critical reviews and considering, but we have to really look at, fundamentally, how do we select the candidates into the profession? How do we prepare them to do that work? How do we supervise them once they were in? And how did we remove people from the profession proactively that were not fitting? And I'm touching on many different taboo subjects in law enforcement, but they're all really relevant for how we end up with tragedy after tragedy after tragedy across the profession.
Thank you. You had a lot of wisdom packed in there. As you were talking, you suddenly helped me draw a parallel to skydiving. So I used to be a skydiver. That was the short story of how I was disabled. The longer story involved childhood trauma. But the first time you go out of the plane after ground school, you barely know enough not to die. And they send you with other instructors that are holding on to you. They don't let go until you pull your chute. They make sure you pull your chute. They radio you to the ground. They do everything they possibly can to make sure that you're okay. And you have no idea until you are further along in skydiving how little you knew and how dangerous that first jump really was. And it sounds like that's the same thing with policing. Is they get 9 weeks, they're in the academy. I know it's very rigorous training. One of my police officer friends here is one of the academy trainers out there, and I know how rigorous it is for all of them, for the instructors, for the attendees going through, for everybody. But you're right, like there's also that real world experience. You can't cover every single situation you're going to come across in the course of your career in 9 weeks. It's not possible. And part of what you're talking about there is that having that nervous system at an appropriate level between the warrior or the guardian. And a lot of police officers, the other thing that's happening that's a part of these tragedies we keep seeing is that nervous system has decided that it is safer to stay in warrior mode all the time.
Right.
And so it feels safer, which makes the person feel less stressed, less vulnerable. But what it's doing is it's wreaking havoc on the body. And it's going to have that officer blind to cases where they can be the guardian.
That's right.
A lot of times. So it is possible, I'm not making any excuses for anybody, but it is possible that the officers that were involved that night, their nervous systems could not read the situation accurately for whatever reasons. It doesn't make it okay, but there can be physiological reasons that these things happen. And then this directly ties into resiliency. So how important do you think it is, Ben, once we get these officers in, to quickly start to encourage some sort of wellness program? And we'll get into the stigma in a moment about that, because I know there's still a lot of resistance to that and feeling like if you're engaging in a wellness practice that there's something wrong with you, versus taking it as something proactive to counter the ridiculously high levels of stress that any police officer is going to encounter over the course of their career.
Yeah, I mean, you just also touched on a ton of different topics that if we had 5 hours, I would love to dive into. But, I mean, I think the reality from any police officer's experience, and this obviously depends on where people are from, the types of calls they experience, the frequency of calls they experience. But there can be life-altering calls any day in a police officer's career at any jurisdiction. And yeah, while some jurisdictions are 9 weeks of training, others are 30 weeks, any of that is holistically inadequate to deal with some of the realities of what we ask our police officers to do for $50,000, right? And so, the concepts around resiliency are so critical. There's recently a course that I went through, and I'll put a plug because it's a free course for any police officers in the country, but the Valor series from the Bureau of Justice Assistance, and some will be listening to this saying, why would I want to take a federal government course? But this is offered to local law enforcement agencies all around the country. And it's designed for entry-level officers, mid-level, and senior-level leaders to really think about kind of that career inoculation to help think through paths of resiliency. We have a lot of unspoken truths of our policing profession around officer suicide, high divorce rate, alcohol usage, obesity, early death. I mean, all of these different factors are just, it doesn't matter if I'm in South Dakota or Texas or here in Washington, D.C., there's commonality in policing culture. Similarly, when I travel outside the United States, I find these cultures exist in other policing professions as well, in other cultural contexts. So this is a challenge with kind of that level of trauma. The reality for police officers is building that resiliency. Yeah, some do stay at that kind of warrior mentality all the time. Others resign, and lose the desire to do police work and instead want to take kind of assignments that keep them away from that the fundamentals of the profession. And I think that's where leadership comes to be, to recognize where people are, to help them through and process their journeys, and to be able to be supportive that sometimes when people experience traumatic events on the job, it's going to take them a period of time to recover from that. And that's part of what the profession needs to do to support healthy police officers. We're not there yet as a profession. And I have not been to a department that I feel like has really gotten that 100% right. But I'm very encouraged recently that more are talking about this, that more are willing to to at least open the door for officers to have a conversation where I think in hearing from the voices of past in policing, that hasn't been the case 50 years ago or 40 years ago, but it's certainly becoming more of a case. It also fits the generational profile coming in. Gen Z coming in, millennials that are currently the bulk of most law enforcement workforces, just have different expectations about that, and I can speak at least from the Metropolitan perspective, my perspective, mental health was talked about and encouraged. Dr. Beverly Anderson with the Metropolitan Police Employee Assistance Program, is a resource to all of our officers and something where supervisors and officers don't hide from saying, "Hey, I'm going to see Doc," right? And so, that's encouraging to me, but that certainly isn't the case in a lot of departments around the country.
Right. And that leads directly into that stigma there. And it's something I was talking to one of my friends here who's mental health liaison for one of the local agencies. And she was talking about, and actually a former client that booked a series of sessions where she wanted to get in half the session. So she needed to bring the session to the police officer. Do that. And no one uses it. So we're having a conversation. There's resistance within responders. It's not just first responders. There's resistance to being well. And it's something I've noticed within myself too. Like, I know that I could do different things to feel better, and I don't always do that. I'm like, well, why? And there's a piece there. But one of the big things that we already know the why too within law enforcement is if you are in an agency that isn't as aware around mental health, there is a huge fear of having your badge taken away from you.
Of course.
You're told that you're no longer fit for duty, or you're forced into early retirement because of a traumatic situation that you've had to deal with.
Yeah, I mean, Katie, you again hit on so many key themes there. So when, if you think about the trajectory for a lot of officers and just things that happen in careers, no one starts off their career and says, hopefully, I want to have financial issues, marital issues, whatever else, right? Like they don't start their career that way. But the reality is, the days off and the scheduling for most police officers is erratic, right? So, you have a Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday night off. Let's say that's your usual weekly nights off. Well, that's great for social life, because that's really when most people are convening. No, it's not, right? So you start kind of building, all right, so I'm going to go out on Tuesday night. Well, who am I going to hang out with on a Tuesday night that's their Saturday, right?
Right.
Other police officers, right? So now your friend group, and I see this often in law enforcement, those connections to the outside world, they start to shrink, right? People, well, do I really want to explain that I just saw someone with a knife stuck out of them, or that was doing this? Well, no, because it's going to be too hard for people to explain. So it's so much easier if I'm just around other cops, right? So that friend group kind of narrows, right? Family connections start to change, right? And the things that bring positive association for many people, holidays, right? Well, that for many police officers, they remember tragedies that they went to on that. Even driving around the community, and I have this driving around DC, I can think of horrific incidents that I've seen on many different street corners, right? People's lives that were ended or upended, and those are kind of living memories that live with me, just the same way that it lives with a lot of different people, right? That builds to that. If you don't have healthy and thoughtful ways to process these experiences, they cumulatively build. So if you look at that kind of trajectory that builds in many police officers, they're working a lot of overtime, right? And that overtime's good. The money's great. They're able to now get into an economic kind of purchasing power they didn't have before. They buy that house, they buy that boat, they buy whatever it was that was probably above their base means. That overtime dries up for whatever reason. Maybe they get hurt or injured. Maybe it's just no longer offered. Now those payments start coming in, right? And they are not able to afford those various things. Now they have debt issues that are stacking on that, right? And you start seeing the stress build. Coping mechanisms are very real in law enforcement, and they're not often talked about, whether it's alcohol, gambling, sex addictions, any of those kind of components. Those are very real kind of coping mechanisms that come to play, and any psychologist in the policing profession will talk about. Gambling. I know many police officers that use that as a coping mechanism, and alcohol is an unwritten piece, right? In a lot of policing professions, it's often excused. Police officers who get DUIs, they'll get a minor suspension, continue on. Why? Because it's just a part of the job. It shouldn't be, right? We have to change that paradigm, right? We have to have healthier ways to cope. A little bit of your introduction of the question guilt tripped me about not going to the gym this morning, but maybe I'll get there this afternoon as motivation to this. But we know that that for officers, being able to get healthy lifestyles, which includes eating right, that's a barrier challenge, right? I mean, in the middle of the night, having something that's comfortable and soothing to eat. A hamburger with some fries, that's a lot better than making a salad and bringing that with. Plus you're in a car eating, so there's all these barriers, but there's ways that structurally we can think about policing differently. One of the barriers to recruitment and retention as well is for folks to have family balance, right? We should have the ability in the policing profession to have a part-time basis. So maybe for a period of 2 or 3 years, you can drop from 40 hours a week to 20 hours a week. Maybe it's for birth of a child. Maybe it's because you're pursuing education or whatever. But rethinking some of the structural bases to how policing is done, is just going to be a fundamental challenge for leaders in the next chapter of this book.
I agree. And the other piece about that isolation, it's not only that wanting to connect with people who get it and being able to speak freely and talk about these things, like you came across someone with a knife sticking out of them today, like your family's going to look at you with shock. Your friends are going to be like, but cops are going to get it. And the other piece of that is when you are experiencing a lot of trauma, the tendency is to withdraw, to isolate, because people are no longer safe. So we lose a lot of our prefrontal cortex, which is our executive reasoning center, goes offline when we experience a traumatic event. And it's not meant to come back online quickly. It takes a lot longer for the nervous system to downregulate than it does to spin up. And that's by design to make sure that we're safe. We have these other complexities as human beings that make us hold on to it, which is a whole other conversation. But just that piece in there, we start to isolate more. And that isolation on its own is so dangerous, especially if you're starting to hang out with other officers who are just doing coping skills and aren't doing anything to balance that with a better diet. And no one is going to want a salad when you're dealing with a lot of emotional crap, myself included. Like, that's where those, I like to call them the very tasty, edible food-like substances come in. The highly addictive ones that are really bad for us that lead to a lot of other diseases later in life. Those actually give our brain a little bit of peace in those moments. But that doesn't mean that we can't balance it. And okay, maybe on days off, we do have a salad because things are a little better. And even if it's not what we really want, we figure out a way to have a salad. Like, one of the ways I eased in is I put taco meat in it, and then it was delicious. And I've got my protein and I've got my healthy greens. But it's, again, and the other piece in there that comes in is when you're dealing with all these things, you start to look at and notice what you haven't been able to do. And we start to focus more on the shortcomings versus all the wins that we've accumulated over these years, over these calls, all the people we've been able to help. The brain isn't going to call those to mind as quickly as it is all the failures, all the street corners, like you talked about, Ben, where someone's life ended or was upended. That's going to be what your mind remembers.
That's
And
right.
as that builds up, shame builds up more and more. And shame makes us quiet. And that is the most dangerous emotion, because that is directly leading to that suicide rate that we need to change.
That's right. And it's interesting in the Valor program, and I swear I'm not just trying to plug it, but I do think it's really beneficial for a lot of officers. They talk about the path for suicide in policing, and not everyone follows the same trajectory, but everyone who ended up at that end life decision, had a lot of the indicators along the way.
Yeah.
And they give a very interesting visual of what that is. And you see the cycles, but you also see the opportunity to disrupt those cycles. And you see the opportunity for those that care about those that are in law enforcement to disrupt those cycles, right? I saw the opportunity for police leaders to rethink their approaches, to rethink that their strategies and their role to be benefiting their officers' wellness and future health, right? Exposing them to opportunities, allowing them to connect more broadly outside the profession, challenging them and pushing them to have part-time jobs, to have, things that are not just policing in their life, and to spend time with family. And I think effective leaders in that space do those things and demonstrate balance at a personal level. And ineffective leaders are quite the opposite, where they role model all the worst kind of behaviors that are in existence there. And I think as we look forward in the policing profession, there's going to be a lot of challenges, not only to get more people willing to serve in these capacities, but we also have to fundamentally think about the structures of how this is being done. I draw a lot of my inspiration from my travel, and I've had the fortune to see many different departments in many different contexts, from departments where you spend 4 years studying, to hybrids of work and study to come on the job, to agencies that really think about policing differently. Recently, I was in the Netherlands and in Spain, both of which the retirement age for officers is considerably higher than here in the U.S. Most officers serve 40, almost 50 years before they retire, and that's just standard until they get to age of pension. But in that what their service looks like is different. I was so impressed with the National Police in Spain, just around public sentiment, and you could feel the pride of being a police officer, municipal, public servant. You could feel it from everyone you talked to, and it was genuine. You could also feel that from the public and the support that they shared to their law enforcement. And that leads, I think, to a lot of the psyche. In a lot of American policing, it's mystified in movies, right? And the reality on the street of what the experience is it's not only challenging in the dynamics that officers encounter every day, but even the systems that they deal with are not designed to work for them, right? They're in some jurisdictions, they're arresting people over and over again, the same people, right? And I hear stories and see stories of, officers who arrest someone for a violent felony, the person is then released, commits another violent felony, right? And that also weighs on the officer because they're told that they're here to keep the community safe, and they realize that they're not able to do that in the way that their profession allows them to do that. I think, holistically, and this is going to be a difficult conversation for many communities because we have 18,000, well, we don't actually know how many law enforcement agencies, around 18,000 law enforcement agencies in our country, and they're all attacking this differently. There's different challenges in each of those communities, and that's part of what makes the American, fabric so unique around this. But it also leads to the challenges where any bad action from any law enforcement officer in any of those agencies, even if the standards are wildly different, affects all of them. And as we think about this, increasing the baseline, the national baseline of what officer resiliency looks like, access to resources, and so forth. It can't be just for one agency here, one agency there. We have to think about kind of that, because an action that happens in Minneapolis affects every police officer in the country. And similarly, we all dread, that national news story, if the officer was in wrong, we all dread it because it has an impact on every officer's service.
Stronger than the impact of positive, like we already talked about. Oh gosh, we could probably talk for hours. Because I was thinking, like, as you were saying that, I was thinking about an officer that I currently work with who's in another country in Europe, and I don't want to list the country because I want to keep him as anonymous as possible. They do not have a stigma around wellness in that country, and he realized he was really feeling high levels of stress, and so he's taken some leave that he is 100% allowed to take.
Yep.
No stigma about it.
Yep.
There's no secrecy of like, oh, officer so and so had, like, there's
Yep.
no shame in it whatsoever. I was like, oh my gosh, we need that in the US so bad. This support of each other, and hey, like, I just need to step back for a little bit, let my nervous system calm down and get regulated again, and then come back into the job again as a better person. And there's so many pieces we need to fix within this, and that's a lot of what we talk about with future policing as well. Like, to get to that level of pride, the system has to be fixed, because that's part of it, is the system's broken. So even if a police officer does everything that they're supposed to do, it does not mean that they have saved the day. They can do everything by the book, and the system can still fail, and it does all the time. I know the people this has personally happened to on the police side and on the civilian side, of where the system has failed. And that's part of the angst, that's part of the frustration that from having pride, more pride for what they're doing out there by protecting the public.
Absolutely. I mean, Katie, it's so true where, the experience from individual officers, and I think that's what you see, the optimism, and I had the pleasure of speaking to every graduating recruit class, for many years, right? You see the optimism and the hope and the excitement, right? With Georgetown University, we built a program called the Police for Tomorrow program, and working with new officers, just that saw opportunity and a way for the profession, and then kind of watching over time as that optimism, changed to reality. And then, at least through my experience, really tumultuous years, from riots in 2020 to, the insurrection January 6th, to trucker protests, to all of those things that unfolded, officers become very hardened to the world around them, rightfully so, because they've been through a tremendous amount, watching, their profession be politicized nationally, their experience, and what happened to them be doubted, or, or essentially relabeled that, well, you weren't actually attacked. Fire extinguishers weren't actually thrown at you. You never were hit with that. Like, for then officers to come in, put in the same uniform to deal with, the same traumas over and over again. And while those are kind of DC examples, those examples exist in every city, every jurisdiction across the country, right? Um, and so, yeah, I think we have to fundamentally think about this differently. Part of the challenge, frankly, in US policing is legacy of leadership. You have in most major cities, the expectancy of the chief is 2 to 3 years. Um, it was a little bit higher. Now that's kind of the rolling average. And again, that's not a lot of time to actually shift and stabilize, the things we're talking about. Some places they have a much stronger legacy, and that's helpful. But if we really want to be committed to some of these systematic kind of changes, first of all, I think you have to pay police officers a salary that attracts it consistent with other pieces. I think you have to reward education. I don't believe that you need higher education to be a police officer. I don't. And that's one of the criticisms I always get is, well, people need no. I mean, I think it is a job about communication. And if you're an effective communicator, whether you have education or not, do I think continued education helps you be more effective? I do. Right. And I think, every officer should strive to continue learning, whether that's through formal education, training, connections to other community organizations. You have to have that spirit to continue to better yourself, right? Because that gives you the drive, and I can tell you from my personal experience, like, yeah, some of the times you're making an arrest, you're like, yeah, this is not going to go anywhere in the system. But this is my part in the puzzle. And my job isn't to change the system in this role. My job is to do this effectively, to leave people in the best outcome that I can for this interaction, which is the scope of my responsibility. And in time, as people rise through ranks of organizations, they can have better and more impactful change. But similarly, I think we have an obligation as a policing profession to unveil that curtain a little bit more. We've been a very closed profession for a long period of time. And we have to be more committed to transparency. And part of that means getting input from those that are outside. I'm not talking about just experts who are self-claimed experts overnight, but truly experts, in the mental health space, in the resiliency space, that can help put in place programs within agencies working with police leadership to be more effective in outcome. And I could change that to any area of policing, but to get outside expertise to work. And what I saw in 2020 play out in a lot of parts of the country, all of a sudden there was this expert industry that came to be to say, here's what policing should do. And police did what they usually do and put up the guardrails to say, okay, well, we'll listen, but then not much changed, right? We need to be fundamentally committed to continuing to innovate and move the profession forward. And that comes with some critical costs. It comes to, acknowledging things that we're doing that we need to change. It comes to being open to saying, I'm going to commit some of that bandwidth that I don't have to that process of innovation. And that's challenging to a lot of policing. But I think, if we really want to retain the generation coming into policing, if we really want to produce better outcomes, if we want to have officers that have critical thought and capacity, then all of this comes to, fundamentally rethinking some of the basic principles of policing today.
It's such a great way to start. I was going to actually ask for an action item, but you just gave a few of them in there. So that was perfect, Ben. Thank you so much. I'm going to make sure that we have a link to the Valor series in there because that's really important. And I've read about them. They're an amazing organization. Please check them out. And I want to leave you with the idea that there is no stigma. You have no shame in needing help for wellness. Like I was never an officer and I needed a shit ton of help to get my head on right. And initially, yeah, there was shame around that. Now there isn't. Now I fully own that because I understand just how many people were in and are in the same boat that I was in when I needed to have my head put on straight again. And there's no shame in it. Life is going to screw you up. And as a police officer, that's going to happen in fast forward because you are dealing with the worst that we have to deal with as humans day in and day out. And this is exactly why I have so much respect for police officers, for all first responders, because you guys are out there doing this stuff I'm not built to do.
Hey, if I can chime in just and say, one of the things where I see hope and optimism is where I sit in a roll call, whether in any agency, and you have a sergeant or a lieutenant that starts the roll call and says, "Hey, if you need help, remember this resource is out there." And I've heard that more in the last 5 years than I ever heard, where you have officials that are actually making reference to it and say, "Go on duty, whatever." Or even just saying, "I went," right? And that kind of ability for leaders to open up in that, it opens a new door in this conversation. No one wants to see names added to the wall, and in particular, names added to a wall for suicide, which is now, nationally recognized. That is something that we as law enforcement professionals can do, whether it's to help our friends, whether it's to help other colleagues, or just to make the profession better, but to talk about wellness resiliency, to attack some of the underpinnings of culture, and I certainly invite anyone who's listening to this who cares about the issues as well to connect. And I know a lot of the leaders at the University of Virginia that we're working with, both on education programs and more broadly at the school and center, care a lot about this and will be happy to connect further with agencies that are thinking about these issues.
Yeah, absolutely. And just to chime in as well, is I've also created a program with that in mind so it's a 5-week program for officers for wellness. I've been able to offer it at a very low price to make it affordable. And it actually helps you work through a lot of the things that Ben and I talked about. So we're going to put those resources in the show notes. Please make sure to check them out. If you are an officer who is struggling right now and you aren't sure where to look, there are so many resources out there. There is no shame in going for it, especially if you are listening. If your chief is telling you in the morning, "I've done this," or reminding you where those resources are, you are in a safe organization. Let them know that you need some help and go find help. And if you aren't comfortable to let them know, then go find help on your own. You can keep it private. You can keep it confidential. Just do something to help build up your wellness, build up your mental resiliency to counter what you're dealing with on a daily basis with your job.
Katie, thank you so much.
Thank you, Ben. I appreciate you for coming on and spending your time with us today. And thank you also, audience. I know you have a lot that you can listen to out there, and I really appreciate you taking your valuable time and spending it with us. I will be back again next week with another episode. And until then, please be well.
Thank you for joining us today. If you enjoyed this episode, please share it with a friend and leave a 5-star review, which helps grow the podcast and reach others just like you. While you're at it, connect with Katie on social media. You can find her on LinkedIn, TikTok, Facebook, and Instagram as @CoachKTDubs. That's CoachKTDubs. This has been the Catapult Effect with Katie Wrigley. Thanks for listening.